Okay, hello AP World History students. This is your review, your next review for the post-classical period, which goes from 600 CE up to 1450 CE. Extremely important that we get this period down and that we understand this for our review. A good part of the test is going to be on this period, and you should expect that this is a really good period to see a lot of multiple choice questions, but also short answers and possible essays, and yes, a possible DBQ. So the more information that you know off of this period, the better off you're going to be for the AP exam. I think in a lot of ways, the post-classical period is kind of a continuation of the classical period. There's just more of an intensification of the development of large land-based empires. So these are big key concepts. We've talked about this before. Okay, again, it's not important that you memorize these. I want you to have a sense of overall like paraphrasing, like what are the big things they're going to be asking from this particular time period. So we look at key concept 3.1. We see here the wording, a deepening and widening of networks of human interaction within and across regions when it comes to cultural, technological, and biological diffusion within and between various societies. Okay, why is this important? Think about what they're saying here, a deepening and widening of networks. That means this is a continuation of what we learned about in the classical period with trade routes, with the interaction of empires, but now we're starting to see them go into more depth and complexity. So key concept 3.2, state formation and development demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity in various regimes. Notice here, a lot of words, right? But in the end, it's pretty simple. State formation means government formation. Here we're talking about empires. And notice, demonstrated continuity. So here we're seeing a lot of things that still happen from the classical period coming out to this time period. Some changes with innovation, diversity in various regimes. So what does that mean? Mean that there are different ways that a lot of these governments are going to organize themselves. And then last step, key concept 3.3. Changes in trade networks resulted from and stimulated increasing productive capacity with important implications for social and gender structures and environmental processes. So guys, think about this for a minute. A lot of wording here, right? And you don't need to memorize them, but what is this basically saying? How do we have a continuation from the classical period of the development of empires, the development of trade relationships, the development of hierarchy? Now all we have to do is put a little bit of meat onto each one of those, kind of get a sense of the specifics. So let's walk through these. So first off, the trade routes and interactions. So this is a continuation of when the Han opened up the Silk Roads. Silk Roads now go into the post-classical period. Or take, for example, the Trans-Saharan. Remember, Trans-Saharan started in the classical period, comes through in the post-classical period. Remember, the big thing with the Trans-Saharan was the use of camels, and also the Bantu tribes had moved from Western Africa down to Eastern Africa, bringing things like iron and the Swahili language. The Indian Ocean still remains important because of its ability for bulk trade as we connect up India and East African city ports. And then last up in Southeast Asia, we're going to start to see the development of a lot of major kingdoms. And you really need to remember these. These are important. The Srivijaya, the Singhasari, and the Majapahit. Now, why are these so important? Because they're in that area that's sort of in Southeast Asia. So we're talking about areas today like Indonesia, Singapore, even within areas today we see like Vietnam, in which there's a diffusion of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. These all mix together. A really good example of this is the kingdom of what's called the Angkor Kingdom. The Angkor Kingdom is located in Cambodia, where they mix together Hinduism and Buddhism. So it's really important. We're seeing, again, same old trade routes, they're just intensifying a little bit more. So how about in the Middle East? In the Middle East, we're seeing interactions because of the development of the religion of Islam. So after the Prophet Muhammad's death, there were the caliphates. Remember, two big caliphates that are important, the Umayyads, who are Sunni, and the Abbasids, who are Shiite. Also, the Mongols are going to be very important for this period. They start to come in from the steppe region, and they reopen the Silk Roads, and they protect the Silk Roads. And that allows for trade throughout this whole region. And then, of course, what's really important for the connection with Africa out to the Middle East, Mansa Musa, who connects up northern Africa to the Middle East when he goes on his Hajj, because he becomes Islamic. He goes on his Hajj to Saudi Arabia. He's going to connect up northern Africa out to the Middle East. So to go a little bit more in the depth of those interactions in northern Africa, because they're actually really important. Mansa Musa comes from a kingdom named Mali, and Mali was formed by Sundiata. Sundiata united the groups in Mali, and then Mansa Musa comes after Sundiata, and he's the one who creates that connection to the Middle East when he goes on his Hajj. That connects up areas like northern Africa, the Islamic caliphates, and the kingdom of Byzantium. Now, one of the key explorers of this time period I want you to remember is a man named Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta was an Islamic scholar and explorer, and he went out and looked at all these areas throughout northern Africa and western Africa and documented how Middle Eastern culture, and especially the religion of Islam, had gone out to these different areas. So Ibn Battuta is an interesting guy. As he went out to these areas, he oftentimes said how horrible things were because he saw a lot of things going on that he didn't feel were pious enough from Islamic culture. But for us, what's important is to demonstrate how Islamic culture changed as it went throughout northern Africa. Now, another big thing that's going to be important is the creation of new social hierarchies, especially the trans-Saharan slave expansion, which we're going to get to a little bit later on in this PowerPoint. But what I want you to remember from this is that trade that takes place in the trans-Saharan area is with people, it's with goods, it's with slaves. And so we have a huge trade route that's taking place across the trans-Saharan. Okay, in Mesoamerica, we have interactions as well. During the classical period were the Toltecs, the Olmecs, and the Mayans. The Toltecs and the Olmecs disappeared. We don't know for certain why, but our guess is, probably makes a lot of sense, climatic changes within the region probably created severe droughts and famines. In that vacuum is filled by a group called the Azteca. And the Azteca had come from North America. They migrated down and filled in that gap and created a massive kingdom or empire in the city of Tenochtitlan. Now, what's so amazing about what they did was that they created an empire of 200,000 people. At the very same time, London had about 40 to 50,000 people. Now, what's even more amazing is the Aztec did this in the middle of the Mexican desert. You probably remember why. They created that irrigation system called the Chimpañas, where they were able to collect all the water and keep them. They also created a tributary state where they would go out and conquer local tribes demanding taxes, and yes, people for human sacrifice as well. Now, if we go down to South America, the Inca also are starting up at this time period in the post-classical. They were originally the Mochi, a religious movement in the Andes Mountains. The Inca, remember, they went out and expanded and conquered local tribes, and they did that by providing that incentive to their emperor. So they would say, you know, when your father, the emperor, dies, the new emperor gets none of his land. All that land goes to the people. That provided an incentive for emperors to go out and conquer more areas. And as they did that, they brought in new people. They did not do the kind of tributary system that the Aztec did. They didn't allow people to keep their own culture. Instead, they formed something called the Mita. And the Mita were social projects that demanded that people participate and that they give up their culture to the Inca. If they did that, though, they would get food, shelter, and protection. Now, another big thing that's going to be important out of this spread of ideas and spread of different cultures is going to be the impact of the Black Death. The Black Death, we think, probably got processed through the Indian Ocean and Silk Road trade. And how did that happen? Well, it started in China, and as it moved out, we think what happened was on ships, it was basically carried by fleas on rats. And when the Black Death with merchants got out to Europe, we tend to think most of the time that poor people were most affected. Actually, the biggest group to die off the most was upper class people within Catholic culture. Why is that? Because they ate meat. And fleas got into the meat, and so it made it more possible for that to take place. Now that becomes really important, because think about what happens after the Black Death. The landowning class, the upper class, is going to contract. One of the stories I always tell with this, you might remember from class, is that at the end of this, homeless people would go up and knock on the doors of landowners, and nobody was inside. They would just go in and say, great, it's our house now. So that gives a sense of how many landowners died out of this. That means the landowners who are left, they need to get laborers to come in and work for them. So there's a high demand for laborers. If you have a high demand, low supply, you're going to have higher wages. Eventually, the wages went up too high. And so what the landowning class did was they switched over to a new type of agricultural system called the three-field system. They would rotate their fields. One field would grow, let's say, grain. Another field might grow barley. And then the other field, they would just leave for the year so it could replenish itself. Then they would switch those fields around. By doing this, they didn't need as many workers. So where did the workers go? They went to local towns. And that created merchant classes and guilds. Guilds were like unions that protected these workers. That's why in many ways Western Europe's going to move out of feudalism very quickly into the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so gotta cut that part out. Key concept 3.2. Take two. So now let's move on to key concept 3.2. You'll remember this is about state formation and the development that's continuous, that has some innovations, and shows a diversity in various types. So first big example that I want to bring up is the Byzantine Empire, which happened because in around 450 AD or so, before Rome falls, Diocletian is going to separate out the Roman Empire. So you're going to have Eastern Rome on one side, Western Rome on the other. Eastern Rome had a very highly centralized bureaucracy, and at the top of it was the emperor, in this case Justinian was a good example, who created a codified system of laws called, I know very unique here, the Justinian Code. Dun, 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 dun. And the Justinian Code basically established a very strong set of hierarchy that organized the Byzantine Empire. It was a very small empire, and it was right in the crossroads of all the major trade routes in the Silk Road, made it very dangerous. But by establishing that very like hierarchical system, they could protect themselves. Then the Eastern Orthodox separated themselves from the Catholic Church in the Great Schism in 1054 CE over theological differences. Okay, what were these theological differences? The primary one was something called Caesaropapism. So in Western Europe, the Pope is separated from the king, and the Pope chooses the bishops. Eastern Europe, Caesar, the emperor chooses the bishops. And so the emperor has far more power. Why is this the case? Because probably because of where Byzantium was located. It's located basically in the middle of the Silk Road, right around the Indian Ocean, where it could be easily attacked by everybody. So they needed to have the emperor be in charge. So even the religion reflected that. Now, another example of governance at this time period was the Islamic Caliphates. And the Islamic Caliphates, you might remember, they get started up after the Prophet Muhammad died and established Islam in Saudi Arabia. He made a huge mistake, which a lot of leaders at this time did. He never provided for a clear successor. Okay, Alexander the Great was another good example of somebody who did that at this time. Now, out of that comes what Muslims call the Rashidun. The Rashidun is the four rightly chosen: Umar, Uthman, Bakr, and Ali. These were the four supposedly chosen by Allah to lead Muslims, but they separated from each other. The Shiite believed, and that's Ali, that the next leader should come from the bloodline of Muhammad. The Sunni, which was Umar, Uthman, and Bakr, all believed that it should be organic, meaning it should come up from the community. Allah is going to choose the next leader. Our two big caliphates then that get started were the Umayyad, who were Sunni. Their capital is at Damascus, and they had a tolerance for minorities, who they called the Dahimi, or the people of the book, Jewish people and Christian people. Then there's the Abbasid, or the Shiite. Their capital is in Baghdad, and they were very much influenced by the Persians. So next up are Chinese governance at this time period, and they were the Sui, the Tang, and the Song. Now, a lot of governance right here, so that can be hard to remember all this. The Sui, Tang, and the Song are kind of easy in a sense, because all of them have the same idea. They're all expanding and dealing with the problem of expansion. So for example, the Sui, who are led by an emperor named Sui Yangdi, expanded China and then had to create the Grand Canal to connect up north and south. Then the Tang further expands China, and they are led by Tang Taizong. They conquered Korea. You might remember we talked about this, that there were 3 kingdoms in Korea. They allied with the Xia, destroyed the other 2 kingdoms, and then they instituted a tributary state. And in this, they created absolute authority from the Tang down onto the Koreans. Good example of that is something called the kowtow, in which when you would go and see the emperor, you would have to bow, literally 90-degree angle. You'd have to bow in order to see the emperor. Last up are the Song, who are led by the Song Taizu. So the Song Taizu had a growth of bureaucracy and what was called the scholar gentry. Who are these scholar gentry? Well, they're people who would take the civil service exam, and if they could pass it, then they were judged to be meritorious, and then they could lead. They could be in leadership. However, we kind of know that what ended up happening was a little corrupt here, because what ended up happening was people ended up getting tutored, and so people who were up the upper class would just be able to afford getting tutors, and this led to a greater division in classes and anger from the peasants. Then we have the 3 major kingdoms that China tended to control: Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Now, Japan was not controlled by China. That's because it's an island. Japan ended up being sort of like fragmented and split up. Remember, the local areas were run by daimyo governors that ran what were called local hans, or provinces. Now, this is the time period of Japanese feudalism. These local areas, the daimyo owned the land. People would work for the daimyo, and then the daimyo would hire out these sort of itinerant warriors who would move from place to place and kind of protect the land. They're called samurai. In Korea, they were divided up into 3 kingdoms during the Civil War. The Xia ended up allying with the Tang, and remember, this is what we talked about. This led to the Tang taking over. So how did Korea deal with this? Well, the upper class said, look, it's fine. We will give our authority as long as you give us our local area. We'll adopt some of your culture. And so they adopted things like the civil service, the Chinese bureaucracy, and the Mandarin language. Very similar in Vietnam. The Sui expanded into Vietnam, and that led to a major rebellion by the Trang sisters. But in the end, Vietnam accepted Chinese dominance if they could have their local culture. And again, the upper class says, fine, we'll do this. We will accept, though, your civil service bureaucracy and Mandarin language. What about out in Europe? Well, when Rome fell in 479 CE, after that, there was a leader who arose named Charlemagne. And Charlemagne tried to reestablish Rome. And he did it through what was called the Treaty of Verdun. He wanted to establish the new Holy Roman Empire, which was supposed to be sort of a pulling back to the old Roman Empire. Instead, what we got were all the major nations that we see today. So nations like France, Britain, Germany, all those ones got formed. They just had different names at that time period. So the kingdoms ended up forming a hierarchy of what was called feudal states, in which you would have the vassals or the landowners, and then the serfs who would work for those owners. They worked on manors, okay, which was the land that they would work on. And the ideology or the belief system of that time period, kind of Confucianism, was called the Great Chain of Being, in which you basically had a social, political, and religious hierarchy with the peasants or serfs at the bottom, priests above them, then landowners, then king, then pope. How about out with the Aztecs and the Inca? So in both of these cases, we had very centralized empires that we talked about earlier. The Aztecs and the Inca both had a strong emperor who was influenced by religious priestly groups. However, some of the differences, the Aztecs believed in what was called cyclical time, and that's why they would do human sacrifice. They sacrificed a human to the gods so that they could replenish the grounds and basically satisfy the gods and keep that cycle going. They also established a tributary system with local tribes where they would take over and then use both human sacrifice as well as goods from them. The Inca, remember we talked about them, the emperor was incentivized to get out new lands, and they had that system of the mita, in which when they conquered people, those people would participate in public projects. Now, the other big thing that I want us to remember is this expansion of slavery at the time. This is not Atlantic slavery, but we are going to see slavery expand at the time in the trans-Saharan route. This is due to the use of camels being able to traverse across northern Africa. However, what I want you to see that's so different from Atlantic slavery is this. A lot of times when people talk about slavery, they'll point to this slave system and say, you see, people in Africa held each other as slaves. There's a major difference, though. The slavery of this time period was people would be taken and they would be used as house servants in northern Africa or in the Middle East. And eventually, they or their children could become a part of the empire. In fact, they oftentimes served in very powerful positions in these empires. That's different from Atlantic slavery, where people became property. How about the role of women? So women had various roles at this time period, primarily because we are now in empires just like we were in sedentary states. Women are still seen to be needed in the domestic sphere for reproduction. However, they were also utilized in other ways. In Japan, women were used to form alliances between powerful families and marriage. In Europe, women were symbols of a way to define men. What does that mean? Well, European chivalry, which oftentimes you hear people say today, wouldn't it be great if we could have chivalry again, right? Just treat women with respect. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Chivalry wasn't just treating women with respect. The idea was that men were women's protectors, and that the men's job really was to make sure that women were sort of like they were weak and fragile, and that's why men had to do things for them. So it's not quite just giving respect to women. The respect was there, but it was tied to sort of like paternalism. And then farmer women. Oftentimes, as the upper class women or the middle class women who lived in the domestic sphere, farmer women had to be out in the field working to be productive. So what are our big takeaways? There's a lot of stuff here in the post-classical era, a lot of different empires that we need to remember. What are our big themes that we should remember? First off, the post-classical period is one in which the land-based empires are a continuance of what we see in the classical time period. It's just intensifying and it's growing. Second, land-based empires related to conquered people through tributary taxes. And remember we talked about this. It wasn't so much that they were getting money. What they were getting was they were getting gifts. They were getting honor and respect. And then last up, the hierarchies that were formed within these civilizations were based, generally speaking, almost around the world, were based on that feudalistic model. Emperor, bureaucracy, priests, military landowners, and then serfs. Okay? So a lot of stuff we have to do with the post-classical era. If we can get this down, we can get a lot of the details down, you're really going to be ready for the AP test. This tends to be a huge part of the test. So hopefully this helped just to get us going, and then we'll continue with this in class. Okay? Thanks, guys, and I will see you in class. Bye.